All right, everybody, welcome back. Bio Bros, Ep7. This time we're going over just a general biome slash style of vivarium that most people make. It's going to be the jungle slash rainforest, all that tropical vibes going on. Going to go over some of the more basic rules and common styles of how it's achieved. And then we're going to kind of go a little deeper into a species or two, use that as an example that we would keep. So, something I actually learned in my research for this one is jungle doesn't really have a real meaning. It kind of can mean like tangled up, overgrowth. Jungle's not a real word, it's just different types of rainforests, is what we would think of as jungle. So mainly we're gonna focus on, like, the tropical rainforest, like what you got in South America, some parts of Africa, a couple parts of Australia even. That kinda stuff is what we're gonna mostly focus on in here, what you really think of when you hear the word jungle. And then, more specifically, a jungle vivarium, specifically just any sort of them, really. Alright, so the first thing gonna kinda go over is lighting. So, in the rainforest and in the jungles, lighting is actually a lot darker than people realize because there are those huge trees that cover, you know, most of the canopy. And then near the bottom, not a ton of light gets through. So, lighting for a lot of the plants we like are actually a lot lighter. No, sorry, a lot dimmer. You don't really need a too crazy bright of a light. However, that being said, higher light tends to bring out different features of plants. I know some of the taller, like IKEA cabinet builds struggle with getting light to the bottom. For those ones, add some spotlights in there. That really does a lot. But really, a lot of the basic ones, you can just throw like a cheap LED aquarium light on and it will suffice for the most part. If you want to get more specific and you want to keep these specific plants, of course, do a little independent research, bump up that light if you need to, or turn it down if you need to. Now I know Alex is doing a bunch of stuff with lighting in the last episode, so anything you wanna chime in on lighting?
Yeah. So, like, when it would come to like UVB and things like that for most tropical animals, or like when you say tropical, like when we're talking about like the deep rainforest tropical reptiles, um, most of the time, if you're gonna do UVB, it's not gonna be like a very high UVB. It's gonna be like a shade dweller, or I don't even know what we consider a 5.0. I think it is. It's gonna be that lower light or lower amount of UVB because just like the light, the UV rays are not getting through all that tropical canopies as deep. They are getting to there, but there's just not as much. And then also with what we would consider lower light, is what we would really want to use for those things. I mean, obviously, like Josh said, you can use higher light and stuff, but lower light really can be any LED because LEDs tend to dissipate in light level very fast compared to like directional lights or like actual light bulbs. For like example, I've did some testing with my light read like meter the other day, and I had my aquarium light, and within 2 inches of it, it was considered highlight. But if you went past anywhere past 2 inches, it instantly dropped to like low light levels, versus a bulb stayed highlight much further down than LEDs.
Yeah, I kinda tested that the old-fashioned way on some of my tanks too. On my 3 by 36 by 18 by 18, tropical vivarium, I have 2 grow light bulbs in there rather than having 1, like, LED strip across the entire tank, and I noticed that
Mm.
when I had the lights in the back of the tank, they were burning some of the plants back there, and so I moved them up to the front, and then now they're not being burned at all. And then again, when I was keeping my just hobby plants, nothing for vivariums or anything, in a tub rather than a tent, I used old aquarium lights to do it, and my carnivorous plants needed a LED light directly above them for it to get any growth. When I had just one light in the middle of the tub, the low light, my aeroids and stuff that I would use for vivariums were growing fine, but the high light carnivores were struggling until I moved the light directly on top of them, and then they were able to grow. So, not just a light meter telling you, like, it is 100% true. Like, I've tested it multiple times just kind of on accident.
Yeah, I mean, I've done the same thing too. Like I've had tanks where I had just regular LED lights and plants were not doing so great. They were growing, but they were kind of growing in slow and they weren't like looking as good versus my like currently one of my crested gecko tanks. I have some screw in light bulbs, like the normal like household light bulbs, but they're s- um still the actual screw in bulbs, and the plants are flourishing and doing way better than they would have or they were doing under just LED lights.
Yeah, so moral of the story on that one is suit your lighting for your plants, not necessarily the animals in these ones, and that's gonna sound weird, but I'm gonna get into it a little more. A lot of the tropical animals come from tropical climates, so they don't necessarily bask in the same way that, like, an arid animal would. Again, a bearded dragon in the desert, that temperature is gonna really, really fluctuate throughout the day. It'll get really
Mhm.
hot and cool down a bit. There's a shade is gonna be way different than the sun. When these animals are living on the equator, equal, right? Equal temperatures pretty much all year round. There's not a
Mhm.
ton of microclimates in there. So you can, as long as you have a stable conditions for them, generally they're okay. So for like dart frogs, for example, they don't really need to bask. They don't really need a warm and cool side. They just want it between 65 and 80 degrees approximately for most species. So for them, lighting doesn't necessarily matter as much as long as they have a good circadian rhythm, like we talked about last week. I would suit your lighting more for the plants. If you want plants with more highlight, crank up the intensity. If you want plants more low light, crank down the intensity a little bit. So, of course, if you're keeping animals that need heat or UV temperature gradients a little more, obviously animals come first. But in jungles, a lot of times suit your lighting for the plants and aesthetics. That's gonna be just fine for most of the animals.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say, um, I would like counter a little bit is there are a lot of microclimates. There's just not a lot of change in temp, but there is still a lot of microclimates. Like if they're out on a branch, it's gonna be a lot warmer than if they're down in the leaves. But you keeping the temperatures in the air about what they like um is going to still make those microclimates too, like where it's wetter it's going to be cooler, where it's drier out in the open it's going to be warmer, so they still have those little microclimates, but it's just not the same as like there's not a distinct, like you said, there's not a distinct hot and cold side and things like that but it's just the natural little microclimates that do happen.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to go out of your way to create them. They just
No.
kind of create them on their own.
Yeah, they just naturally occur.
So since we're kind of working from the top down, let's get into watering a bit. So tropical, obviously we're getting wet, right? This is going to be a high humidity environment. We need to keep that humidity high in general, right? Of course,
Mhm.
again, species and different things. I'm gonna quit saying that now. Hopefully you have it through your heads, guys. Do your individual research. But generally speaking, high humidity. And the best way to achieve that is with misting. Foggers can get a little weird depending on species and cause respiratory infections and all kinds of weird stuff. Misting is generally the best way to go. A few ways to go about it: hand misting and auto misting. Auto misting is my favorite way by far. It is way easier. Definitely worth it to get a nice automatic mister, in my opinion. Makes so you can go out of town for the weekend too and not worry. Uh, Hand misters are great. I've used them and had a lot of success with those. The best ones are pressure misters. Get one that's for, like, spraying weeds and even an automatic one that's for that. Fill it up with RO water. That's another pro tip, guys. RO water does not stain glass. No hard water stains on there. My grandpa taught me that trick. He used RO water to clean his glass on his fish tank because it didn't matter if he accidentally oversprayed into his tank because he didn't have a lid. It was just a reef tank. And so he would use RO water as glass cleaner. So pro tip on that one, fill your misters with RO water. Also won't clog up your nozzles. Uh, get a nice auto mister. It's really, really worth the investment, in my opinion. Obviously, if you don't feel like spending that much, because it is a little pricey, hand misting is great. And then depending on your needs again, adjust it. Some tanks need it twice a day, some need it every 3 or 4 days, and you can maintain really high humidity. That's just gonna depend on your specific environment and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I would also say with like auto misters versus hand misters, auto misters you can actually replicate their natural environments a lot better than hand misting. And the only reason I say that is because a lot of these species, like for example, Madagascar giant day geckos, which I keep and have bred and successfully and everything, they like a nice spike of humidity right when the lights go out because in the wild it's super hot during the day, but once it gets cool, humidity spikes because it's been hot all day and the air has been evaporating. But once it's starting to cool down, it's condensing more, so it's becoming a lot more humid in that environment. Which you can do hand misting if you want to be up or you're setting the time to go off when you're going to be there or anything like that. But with that auto misting, you can have it just go off for a little bit right when the lights go off, and it can raise that humidity for the night, just like it would in nature. And then another thing, if you don't have access to RO water, because not everybody does, I use spring water from like Walmart. Get the gallon jugs. It also doesn't clog your like nozzles and things like that. Don't use distilled. That can actually pull minerals out of your animal. Um, but uh, spring water, it's safe for frogs. I've used it with dart frogs. I've used it with all my geckos. It doesn't clog your tubes or anything like that either. And you can buy it's like $1 something a gallon at like Walmart and stuff. And another thing for helping with humidity, if you're just like losing a ton because of the screen lids, a lot of people will do things, especially with dart frogs. They will put like a sheet of glass across the top of the tank. Now, if you're doing it for things like day geckos and stuff like that, you can't really do it for the entire top of the tank because they need heat, they need UVB, and UVB will not penetrate through glass. And obviously, neither would the heat, or it could cause other problems like glass cracking and bursting and things like that. But you could always put it on part of the tank and then have the other part open for those two. But it does help hold in a lot more humidity for those species because it doesn't allow it to completely evaporate through the screen without anything stopping it.
Yeah, I've used plastic wrap too, because it's
Yeah,
really easy to make it more modular. You can have it just an inch off or 2 inches off or 3 all the way half the tank, right? So you can cover as much as you need to and really
yeah.
dial it. So that's nice too. It's really cheap option. Does need to be replaced every so often, but
They
not
did
that big.
actually. I think it was Zoomed. I can't remember if it's Zoomed or Exoterra, but I just saw it recently. They came out with like a silicone mat.
Oh, yeah, I saw
Um,
that. That's super
yeah,
cool.
and it's they use it for holding in humidity and stuff, and it actually allows UVB through. But it's more like if you had like a 10.0, which is like during readings would be like five or between 5 or 10 on the UVB scale, I believe. It would be 2.5 to 5. It would be half. It basically cuts it the UVB in half when it's going through, but it does allow UVB through. And they also made it so it's heat resistant. So like if it's close to a heat lamp, it's not going to just shrivel up and melt. But it seemed like a really cool product. I personally haven't used it yet. Um, but from the research and stuff that they've done, it looks like it's going to be a really cool product.
Yeah, it's super cool. I definitely wanna try one out eventually and get a
Yes.
real review out there. Uh, alright, and then keep on with the theme of the day, moving top down, we got the sun, lighting, rain, water. Now let's get into the scape, plants, not animals yet, but plants, scaping, wood, all that kind of stuff. In these This is where it gets fun. This is where the tropical style tanks really start taking off and pulling away from the rest of the group. They're really pretty. You can put some amazing things in there and have them look really, really good. Every vivarium you see on Instagram that looks awesome, what they all have in common is they're tropical, right? The biodiversity is just insane. The scaping potential is insane. Pretty much every method of background making works and works very well. Some only work in wet environments, and of course, we just talked about that. Generally, these are going to be pretty wet environments. It's awesome. You can get moss growing on pretty much every surface. Nearly every cool plant you can name goes in there, and they do very well. It's a really good time. The only thing I would really watch out for is poor plant selection. A lot of people put these plants in there and they don't realize that these plants get 4 or 5-foot leaves. They'll put, like, golden pothos in their tank, and it just overruns it, and the tank does not look good. Yeah, it's a cheap option, and it grows very, very well. I would totally use it if I was, like, breeding a ton of frogs that lay eggs on leaves, and then I'll have to snip the leaves and things to raise them because it's free, just replaces itself, but it's not a good recipe for a pretty tank because people don't realize golden pothos is a monstrous plant. I've seen in my life personally, like 3.5-foot leaves on that thing. It is a huge plant. It's gonna overrun your little tank. And then other thing to watch out for is rotting wood. Make sure that your wood can withstand high humidity. The
Mhm.
best woods are the same ones people would use for aquariums. If it works in aquariums, it will work in a tropical vivarium of sorts.
Yeah, I will say one of the big woods that are like type of woods that a lot of places are like, oh, you can use this, you can use this. And personally, I've used it a couple of times, but it always gets fungus or it rots. It's just not good for that high humidity. Is grapevine. People are always recommending it. I always see it online, things like that. But that wood is really not good for the super high humidities. At least my personal experience. They've always either grown a fungus, grown a mold, or just started rotting away really quickly.
Yeah,
Um,
I noticed so bad too. I had a piece of grapewood in my corn snakes tank when he was young, and he was having a little issue shedding one time. It just wasn't coming off great. And so I upped the humidity in his tank to help get it off. And so it was fairly moist for 2 days maybe.
mhm.
And in that 2 days, it already started molding on me.
Yeah,
And I was like,
Grapewoods.
"Bro, man, this stuff is not durable." I don't like
No,
grapewood for any tanks really personally. I don't think it looks great. I bought it because that was what was recommended to me when I was young. But yeah, I say stay away from grapewood. Ghostwood is all the good parts of grapewood and none of the bad parts.
yes, I completely agree with that. And it's even better because it looks better than Grapewood, in my again personal belief. And other things, so like Shaw was saying, you gotta be careful with your plant selection. If you do get a plant that is gonna get too big, like golden pothos, because golden pothos in your tank, it's never gonna get a 3 foot leaf. It just
No,
it's not gonna happen. But it will, like you would say, will run over the tank. But it would just it's essentially, are you willing to trim it constantly? Not like every week or anything like that, but like, are you willing to be trimming that tank more than you would be if you went with something different? Because that golden pothos will continue to grow, and you're just gonna have to trim it all the time. Um,
yeah,
Other things that to avoid that a lot of people I've seen people throw them in tanks and stuff, and it's just like that's gonna get way too big. Monstera deliciosa, I've seen people throw that in tanks, like when it's a really small plant, and those get gigantic, even if they are in tanks. Like
yeah,
even
and
if you're
it's really
trimming it
hard.
back.
Yeah, and it's hard to deal with, a plant that is very well established in these vivariums, because
Yes.
as in this next bit we're gonna get into of substrate and all that, is it'll root all the way through your entire tank, and you try to
Mhm.
pull this thing out, and it just wants to rip your entire tank with it.
Yeah,
It's
it's taking
really,
everything.
really annoying. I've had to deal with it, and it's not fun. Um, just be really thorough about your plant selection. A lot of people, they just kinda watch the first recommended YouTube video that's a little outdated or just not made by somebody who's really into plants. They're just into, making functional tanks, which is totally fine. But be thoughtful about your plant selection. Pretty much all these cool collector house plants come from the jungle too. If you're replicating the jungle, they'll do well in them. Like our guest from a couple episodes ago, Owen, that guy has some seriously fancy plants in his vivariums, and they're doing awesome. And
Oh,
people
yeah.
would never think of that as a vivarium plant, but it is. It fits all the boxes of a plant that can go in a vivarium.
Yeah, and just the key thing we're saying is do your research. Do as much research as you can, to figure out exactly what plants you like, what you would like to see in the tank, what would work well in the tank, what would work well with your animals. Because you don't want to put plants in there that these animals are going to crush. You don't want to put plants in there that could hurt the animals. Like, you just have to do your research to find out these kinds of things. And sometimes you just have to do it through personal like experiments. Like I've done I had some Hoya that weren't doing well, and everyone's always like, "Oh, I never water my Hoya. I never water my Hoya. I do it like every once a month or whatever." I threw them in a tropical tank that was my dart frog tank that had 100% humidity, and they were never happier. So it's plants are not a one fits all the time either.
Yeah,
You just
no,
gotta do
just
your research.
yeah, it's kind of recurring theme on this show is do your research, do independent research, do more and more, learn and take your time. Like I'm a little slightly off topic, but I'm taking my time on my bearded dragon vivarium build right now. YouTube video will come out on that one soon. Don't worry about it, guys. Uh, I'm taking my time on it, and I'm very happy with how it's going. I've spent, like, 2 months trying to figure out the substrate, and I think I'm onto it. I've got supplies in the mail, got some of it here already, and I'm just gonna do small scale experiments and really take my time on it to really achieve the look that I want, and that's worth it in your builds. Like, remember, these things are gonna be in your house for years. Like, take your time. Make sure it looks
Yeah,
really nice. Like, just really take your time, do it right. Do it right the first time, you won't regret it, but you will regret sloppily throwing something together.
and I can say that from experience because I have at least one or two tanks that I got super excited about, threw it together real quick, and now I look at them and go, "Why did I do this?" Because they just don't look as good as I would like them to be.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, who hasn't done that? It's like a rite
oh
of
yeah,
passage, you know?
yeah.
Everybody
It's just something you just got to work through. But taking your time planning these things out is the best option. And also, don't like when we're saying do your research. Don't just like listen to us. Listen to as many different people as you can find. Don't listen to just one person. You want to find all these different like people who because everyone has different opinions and has different experiences and things like that. You want to research that kind of stuff so you can figure out what works best for you.
yeah, and then we'll move it down one more level into the substrate. Substrate's where it gets a little weird for me, actually. I've been, like I kinda alluded to, really working on substrate.
Mhm.
Substrate is a weird one. ABG mix, it stands for Atlanta Botanical Gardens, they kinda invented this mixture, and real mixture is a lot different than what people call ABG nowadays. People call ABG just basically any sort of tropical vivarium substrate. That's not
Yeah.
true. ABG has a real recipe. I don't know it off the top of my head, doesn't really matter, but it's generally lots of coconut fibers involved, a little bit of sand sometimes people will toss in there, sphagnum moss, um, what else people throw in there? Like coconut fiber, coconut bark,
Char-
sorry,
charcoal.
charcoal, um,
Um,
orchid bark. People throw lots of stuff in there,
yeah.
but general rules to follow are make sure it's something that's not gonna compact really, really easily. You don't want it to just turn into a brick in there. That is that's a one-way ticket to mold city.
and
It
also
is
just
no
dead
good.
plants.
Yeah, it's make sure it doesn't ultra compact, uh, and then so fairly loose and fairly low in nutrient content, actually. The animals that you're gonna put in there are going to add the nutrients themselves, the soil will b and then things that aren't gonna instantaneously break down, right? Sphagnum moss will eventually turn into peat moss, but that is a process that takes forever. So if you're using, like, milled sphagnum moss, you have a long time before that substrate really breaks down, and same thing with, like, coconut fiber, that takes forever. Obviously, if you're mixing in things like sand or carbon, those are gonna never break down really,
Yeah,
like
and
or
if
aqua
you're
soil as well. People put
yeah,
in aqua soil into there. Most popular ones like fluval stratum. I'm not an
mhm,
advocate for fluval stratum, actually. I think it's one of the lowest quality aqua soils around. Yeah,
hmm,
if you're just gonna mash it up and put it in a mix, yeah, it'll be fine. But if you wanna use that a little more primarily, some people do that with, like, paludariums that are gonna be really, really wet. The substrate does really good because it's made for being all the way underwater, but tons of plants love it. I would opt for one of the higher end brands, like ADA is probably one of the best. I don't believe it's UNS who makes it, but it's one of the companies that the UNS guys, like, work heavily with. They're always, like, associated together. Um, that's a really good brand as well.
yeah, my unpopular opinion, I guess, when it comes to substrate is I don't I've learned through the years that I don't like coconut fiber, like Eco Earth. Um, I'm not saying it's a bad product. I just have ran into a lot of problems with it. Either is way too wet and molds, or it dries out way too quick, or it's just too loose, too compact. I've had problems with it nonstop.
I
Um,
think of it more of as an ingredient rather than a
well,
whole
see,
substrate itself, like,
for
I
for
I run into the
me,
same issues, but if I use it as an ingredient, I've tended to be better, and I kinda like it. But I see where
for
you're
me,
coming from, though, it is picky.
yeah, and like for me, even when I've used it as an ingredient, it's still just it's because like when I've used this ingredient, like I've made a mix and I've used it as like the base with like a little bit of sand, some wood, and things like that. It still just dries out way too quickly for me. And I say that because like I recently like revamped one of my leopard geckos tanks, and I didn't change the substrate. I just had like just refluffed it up because it was really compact. And it's basically it was a substrate mix that I made when I was much younger and didn't know them as well. So there's a little bit too much sand in there and things like that. But it's sand. It's basically sand, coconut fiber, and there's like some charcoal and things like that in there. There's not a ton of stuff, but it I sprayed that thing down and like soaked all of it before and like mixing it up to get rehydrated and everything, and then set up the tank and then sprayed it down again. The very next day, the first inch or two was already bone dry, and
Um,
that's what I've always ran into with that.
I do remember just brought up in my mind for some reason, we did forget one important thing, is leaf litter. So,
Yes.
trees drop leaves, that is not just a Northern Hemisphere thing. Leaves are temporary. If you've been keeping plants for any bit of time, even just houseplants, you've probably heard somebody say something along the lines of leaves are temporary, don't get heartbroken if one leaf dies as long as the rest of the plant is doing great. Happens in the jungle too. So leaves are constantly falling on the ground. So nearly every rainforest you go to is going to have this thick layer of leaves on top of it. So leaf litter and other botanicals of sorts, so seed pods and little twigs and things like that have a really solid and important role in these tropical vivariums. To use dart frogs as an example, something that I heard and kind of stuck with me a bit was a dry feet and a wet back. That's what dart frogs are looking for. So they want to be able to stand on a dry leaf or a dry piece of wood, but have the humidity be 80 to 100%.
Yeah.
So, I mean, think about like a if you live in like Florida or have been there, you're familiar with it, like a sidewalk there, right? You can touch the sidewalk, that's dry, but the air is still very humid. So that's kind of what dart frogs specifically are looking for, and so a lot of other animals are too. When they're constantly exposed to wet on their feet, just like with people, you'll get trench foot, right? They get
Mhm.
animal equivalent of that.
Yeah, and then one other thing too with it goes along with substrate and leaf litter and things like that, especially in tropical tanks. It is not 100% needed, but it will make your life way easier. Is cleanup crews. So isopods, springtails, some people use millipedes and things like that. Things that take your animal's waste and break it down to be nutrients for the plants. Takes dried, dying leaves and breaks them down to be nutrients back into the plant and continues that cycle. They're they're super helpful when it comes to maintaining an enclosure. It makes it to where a tank that you don't have them in, you're gonna have to replace the substrate like every 6 months, maybe even less than that. Versus a bioactive with these um, isopods and springtails and things like that, you won't really have to change the substrate unless something goes wrong and there's like mold or anything like that. You might just have to add more in because obviously over time it does break down a little, and get to the point where it can be a little too broken down. So you might have to add fresh substrate in and things like that, but they make it to where you don't have to constantly change it out and stuff. And it also, like Shaw was saying, about your animal waste and stuff going to the plants for nutrients. That's because of these microorganisms breaking down the animal's waste to then be small enough for nutrients for the plants.
Yeah, these, tropical tanks suit very well to having going bioactive. So, the difference between bioactive and naturalistic is that bioactives are you're trying your best to create a full ecosystem by having the autotrophs of plants, heterotrophs of your plants, and then decomposers and detritivores, which would be like your isopods and springtails and things like that, and creating that full chain of ecosystem. And naturalistic just means looks like nature. So that kind of stuff is super helpful and very, very easy to achieve in these tropical tanks. The
Oh yeah.
the decomposers and detritivores are very readily available. They're even selling them at the chain stores now I've seen, and
Yeah.
so easy to do. In, like, arid tanks, it gets a little more tricky. It's not
Hmm.
terribly hard, but it's not just easy. It's a super easy, wide open free throw to turn a tropical tank bioactive. And then let's get all the way down to the very bottom. Something that's very important for most builds, again, not all, but most, is the drainage layer. This is what will keep your tank from turning into a swamp, right? You go walk out in the forest and it's not wet, it's moist, but not wet on the ground, right? This drainage layer is what's going to keep that from happening. So basically, drainage layers are anything that is going to allow water to pool in there. Tons of different ways to build them. Um, there, you can put them in lava rock. That's a classic one, or leca. And then some of the other nice ones I like too are egg crate ones, sponge,
Hmm.
all sorts of things. Doesn't matter as long as it keeps the water off of the substrate. That's what you need. A spot for all that excess water that you were missing to go. Um, One thing I'll say watch out for, I don't know, I have not been able to figure out where this information keeps circulating, but it is outdated and I still keep seeing people do it, is using sphagnum moss as a barrier. So,
Yeah.
obviously, if I use lava rock and put my substrate straight on it, my substrate's gonna leak into there. So, you're gonna use a barrier, usually some sort of, like, window screen is kind of the big one that people use. They're going to they'll use sphagnum moss for that, but sphagnum moss breaks down, and it actually can harbor some bacteria and stuff in there. Don't do that one. Go for something artificial that will not break down. I know normally I say go as natural as you can with everything. not drainage layers. You do not want those breaking down on you. It's a disaster.
And you also wanna watch your drainage layers, especially for, like, a really high humidity species like dart frogs and stuff. Um, they can overfill. I've had when I kept dart frogs in the past to where I had to dig down and actually drain out the drainage layer because there was so much water going in. That could also be a sign that you need to cut back on your misting and stuff a little bit. Uh, and like as long as humidity's not like dropping, if you're cutting back, if you're hit, that's how you have to keep your humidity level. That's how you have to do it, and you can just have to drain your drainage layer every now and again because you don't want that water getting up and sitting in the substrate because it will cause mold and other things that are going to be harmful towards your animal and towards your whole setup.
Yeah, it'll turn you from having a nice tropical environment to a full-on swamp.
Yeah,
And
not a
if you're
good
not
one.
trying to make a swamp, things kinda go bad. Plants tend to not like that as well. They will rot on you, then you have a bunch of dead plants in there, and your animals are start getting unhappy. It's a disaster. But I do recommend always putting a drain in your drainage layer
Mhm.
itself. So if you wanna get real fancy with it, drill the bottom of your tank, and you can have a ball valve or some sort of way to drain it directly out always. Or you can make a little standpipe. Look at aquariums with overflows in them. Exact same setup, basically. Then you can put like an airline tube in there and just make a quick little siphon and drain it out if you need to. They're also underrated feature of drainage layers is they can help keep your humidity stable because there's just this bank of water in there that'll go into your substrate and it'll keep it pretty a little more consistent. If you have a dry, completely dry drainage layer, it's easier for fluctuations to happen. That water is a very good um, what's the word I'm looking for? Like heat sink. It doesn't like to change, right? If water is one temperature, it likes to stay that temperature. So it really helps keep your entire system stable when you have a nice little pool of water in there.
Yeah.
All right, so uh, do a bit of a recap here. So lighting, generally speaking, lighting is mostly for plants in tropical builds. Of course, some animals need heat and UV. Take care of that first, but generally, light to the plants. Misting, gonna wanna keep it wet. Auto misters or hand misters, definitely love the auto mister. They're great. Very solid investment. Um, the actual meat of this thing, the scape, be smart about plant selection, be smart about your wood selection, make sure that's not gonna rot on you. Really take your time on your plants, create a work of art in here. And another quick little tip is start small with your plants. Get small cuttings of plants. Don't go big established plants. I know it's really appealing to have this tank look pretty today, but if you get small cuttings, they'll really establish in the tank and grow in and truly vine on there and climb up everything. It'll look this really, really cool. Looks way better than just throwing big plants in there. Um, substrates, that one, again, you can freestyle real hard on your substrates. Just follow some general rules, make sure it's not susceptible to mold and rot. No fertilizers or anything crazy like that in there that are gonna harm your animals. And then just kinda freestyle a bit. I like to watch a few YouTube videos, read a few different articles and things, and kinda combine their ideas into one. Take the take what they have in common, combine all those, and then you're usually pretty good. And then drainage layers, those are fairly basic really, but they are necessary for most builds.
Yeah.
And anything you wanted to add on there, Alex?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well.
Alright. So, that was our, uh, video on vivariums and tropical ones specifically. Uh, soon we will be doing other videos of the, like, different other ones too. We'll do, like, desert, we'll do some temperate ones, we'll do, you know, maybe even aquariums a bit too, get into that a little bit. Freshwater
Mhm.
versus saltwater versus brackish. Who knows? Leave in the comments if there is one specifically you're like, I wanna hear about how this kind of functions and works. And then,
Yeah.
other than that, we'll see you guys next week with a new episode.
See you guys. Don't forget to like, follow, check out our Instagrams, our personals, and the show's Instagram. If there's anything y'all want to see, let us know. But other than that, y'all have a good night, morning, day, whatever y'all listen to this.